Here is another oft-stated discriminating factor that purportedly defines the difference between the East Coast sound and the West Coast sound. This one, okay, this one is a major one. This one is referenced over and over and over again, and I'm not entirely sure why. It seems almost insane. But one of the most stated distinctions between Moog and Buchla, East Coast and West Coast, is that Buchla instruments don't use keyboards and Moogs do. Okay, first, okay, no, I don't even know where to start with this one because it's so big. Okay, let's be very clear. Don Buchla's initial design had a control device that was used to control tape recorders. And it had basically capacitive touch controllers that turned tape decks on and off. It wasn't a keyboard. But again, it did have kind of the layout of a keyboard in that it was a sequence of tabs. So there was that there at the beginning. Now at the beginning of the Moog synthesizer, there was a lot of discussion between Bob Moog and Herb Deutsch and others regarding how this particular musical instrument would be controlled. Herb Deutsch did assert that the keyboard would be the best choice. And the fact of the matter is, and even Don Buchla agrees with this, it is a very efficacious means of controlling frequency with the ability to do so in incremental steps. It's ergonomic, it's visual, it is really an ideal layout. The concern was, for some, that having the traditional keyboard would lead to traditional outcomes. And as Herb Deutsch has often pointed out, it didn't stop all of those crazy 20th century composers with serial music and everything else in the early part of the 20th century. Certainly a person can be influenced to play traditional music when there is a traditional music interface, but that isn't to say that composers were incapable of using that interface any way that they wanted. And in the case of the Moog synthesizer, if you go back to the 950 and look at it, you had the ability to, range and scale that keyboard so that those were not Western half steps. They didn't have to be. They could be anything. And there were even versions of Moog control where you could tune each entire key to get the outcome that you wanted. So the keyboard was not the immediate choice for the Moog synthesizer. It was something that they eventually agreed upon, and it was largely Herb Deutsch who insisted on it. And we're going to talk about the effect that keyboard had in a later video, but for now, the keyboard was chosen as a simple interface. Also, they were available. Okay, so conversely, Don Buchla, he had that controlling pad and then went with a sort of capacitive controller device that had a sequence of tabs that you could play like a keyboard or not play like a keyboard. So the fact of the matter was, it wasn't that it was a keyboard or was not a keyboard. It was merely not the traditional keyboard layout, even though it was a series of, potentially sequential metal pads. So then you could look at this 100 series controller and say, yeah, that's not a keyboard. Yeah, Buchla went a different direction, and therefore Buchla doesn't have keyboards, and he didn't want keyboards. That was a Moog thing because Moog went for traditional music with keyboards, which I'll address in a bit. You could say that, but then you'd have to come up against the 101 or the module 237 in the early 70s, which was in fact the first modular within the voltage control context polyphonic keyboard controller. It's a keyboard, a traditional keyboard, right there in the 200 series. And then, even if you go as far to look at the 218, yes, it is capacitive, but the layout is a keyboard. In fact, if you look at the 400 or a number of other Buchla created devices, they all have keyboards on them. They are not the traditional, they're not a piano. They're not the kind of keyboard that, other companies, this kind of keyboard, although in some cases it's even that kind of keyboard. So the fact of the matter is, Buchla did use keyboards. And he even had a quote. He went so far as to tell you not to portray him as not using keyboards. And yet, this premise is one of the first things stated when people are trying to define the East Coast, West Coast thing, is that, Buchlas don't have keyboards. And it's baffling and demonstrably untrue. There have been a lot of Buchla keyboards. There are Buchla keyboards today. So, yeah, that one, it is really tenacious and yet so demonstrably untrue.